Hello and welcome to the discussion of Book 8 of Plato's Republic for Introduction to Philosophy. This will be our last lecture on Plato's Republic. There are another couple of books in the text, Book 9, which is on tyranny, and Book 10, which rounds out the book. But we're going to stop at this point in Book 8. We'll say a little bit about tyranny, but that comes out of the discussion of Book 8, and we can get a sense of of where that's going, I think, if we think about that. So this sort of takes us full circle, and here we sort of see the city in relation to the soul, and we see the sort of cycle of regimes, excuse me, as Plato describes them, the kind of the series of different regimes, of different sort of social and political organizations, and how they relate to the individual soul. And Plato has a theory about how they change and progress, and how they sort of historically relate to one another. So we're going to get into that in Book 8. And of course, here we'll also see in detail Plato's criticisms of democracy, which of course come from the experience of the democracy in the 5th century, and what happened in its decline and the death of Socrates. So we'll sort of look at how that's pitched here in Book 8, where Plato is sort of giving us, through Socrates, I think, his experience, that experience of the democracy, and telling us from Socrates' perspective some of the issues and some of the kind of big structural problems that emerged in democratic society. Okay, so this is the sort of order of Plato's 5 regimes. And we start with the just city, which is called aristocracy, which basically just means the rule of the best. And people sometimes get confused with this today, because we have this sense of aristocracy, this sort of historical notion of aristocracy that means sort of rule of the landed elite, people with wealth, they are the aristocracy. That's not what Plato means when he calls this regime an aristocracy. It comes from the word aristos, meaning the best. The just city is the rule of the best, meaning the rule of those best fitted to rule. And so we've seen Plato's arguments for that. It's rule based on reason and the common good. And so that's the just city. Now, the story we get here is a story of decline, and each regime is sort of progressively worse than the last, as we'll see. So starting on from the just city, we get a city that's based on honor, and that's called timocracy. So timocracy is a regime that gives maximum value to the idea of honor and the sort of preservation of social honor, which sort of comes with sort of class position, status, and the sort of the particular function that you perform in that society. So from an honor society, we go to an oligarchy, and an oligarchy is based on the idea of wealth. It's the wealthy who rule. In a democracy, which comes next, which is sort of second from the bottom, notice, on Plato's scheme, and democracy, it's the demos in charge of the people. We've talked about how that basically means something more like the mob, the plebs, the sort of, the unwashed masses, in this ancient sort of sense of the demos. So it's literally rule of the people, and we saw that meant at the time of the classic democracy in the 5th century, that meant the sort of extension of the franchise to other people who were Athenian-born citizens, and those people had more power. Those people were sort of benefited from the massive public works drive that was accomplished in the time of Pericles. So there's a sort of extension of the franchise towards the sort of towards the ordinary citizens who don't hold a lot of property. And so that's, even though that doesn't extend, as we saw, to people who are not citizens, and of course the class of slaves, and of course women were not genuine citizens. So a lot of kind of qualifications there. And democracy comes before tyranny, the worst of the regimes, the most sort of corrupt, the most violent. And so that's sort of where we end up in this sort of terrible place after going through this sort of cycle of the regimes. So, important thing to see here, there is a kind of logic to the progression of regimes. There is a logic to historical change as Plato describes it. And that means in this case that as each regime collapses and gives way to the next, it does so because of its own intrinsic vice, its own kind of intrinsic conflict that it can't contain. And we'll see Plato tells us a story about how that happens in the case of each regime, the conflict that leads to its downfall. And that's always sort of based on its sort of intrinsic vice, the idea that there's something in that regime which sort of leads to this conflict that it can't resolve, and that sort of gives way to the next. So it's not a random thing, it's not a completely random shift from one society to the next. There's a logic to it, and the society that comes next comes out of the kind of vices of the regime that's collapsing and giving way. Now, so this is a really key point, and we've explored this before throughout the book, and we've seen this sort of relationship emerge. So there's a relationship in each case between the city and the soul, or as Plato, I think, describes it, the soul is structured and imprinted by the structure of the city, right? So I like this quote that he uses on page 22. Or do you suppose that the regimes arise from an oak or rocks and not from the disposition of the men in the cities, right? So it's just like the regime, the type of city, the type of society we live in is just it's just a blow up of the disposition of the people in those cities, right? So it depends on for Plato, as we know, it depends on the specific arrangement and order of the soul, and the order of these three things: reason, or the sort of logical part, the spirited part, spirit, and appetite or desire. Those are the three parts of the soul, and their sort of changing arrangements give rise to different cities. As we saw, there's only one stable arrangement, there's only one stable hierarchy for Plato, but if you mess with them, and as we'll see, to each regime corresponds a particular form of the soul. And each sort of degenerate regime, there corresponds a form of the soul that is not healthy, that is not stable, and that's going to give way to another, an even less sort of stable and less healthy regime. So that's the argument there, that we're going to see this relation between the city and the soul. And in fact, as we'll see, there's an argument here that arrangement tells us the specific way in which those cities are unhappy. Right? Apart from the perfect city, which is, perfectly just, as we know, each of the other regimes has a specific type of vice and a specific type of unhappiness that leads to its downfall. Now, interestingly, I think we get also in this chapter what should count as, I think, a final answer to Thrasymachus, and a kind of final answer to the problem of justice, and the idea of whether justice is good for its own sake. And we saw Thrasymachus in the first chapter defending, or sort of appealing to this idea of the ruler who can sort of flout all convention, the ruler who can do whatever they want and sort of declare that justice is this, and get everybody in the society to serve their interests. And so that picture emerges again when we come to this discussion, because that sort of person that Thrasymachus is identifying emerges as the tyrant. And that person, Socrates is going to tell us in this chapter, is the most unhappy person we could possibly imagine, right? So the tyrant can't possibly be happy. because of the way their soul and its arrangement has become so twisted, so that there's no, it's not a kind of, there's no rational order in the soul. It's become a kind of a conflict where the strongest party is one that doesn't have the good of the whole as its concern, and that can only lead to a very sort of a bad and unhappy state of affairs. So Socrates says on 223, must we next go through the worst men, the man who loves victory and honor, and then in turn an oligarchic and a democratic man, and the tyrannic man finally, so that seeing the most unjust man, we can set him in opposition to the most just man, right? And remember, that was the challenge of chapter 2, right? Show us the just man and show us that person in relation to the most unjust person who can get away with whatever they want. That person is the tyrant, right? The person who is able to set laws for their own advantage. And what we find here is that that person is, because of the way their soul is arranged and organized, they are actually in the sort of most advanced state of unhappiness. It's like they're controlled by an addiction. It's not a kind of freedom that they're exercising, despite what Thrasymachus claimed. So just to take up the quote again, he says, if so, we can have a complete consideration of how pure justice, so here we go, let's make a note of this, of how pure justice, that's the wrong one, of how pure justice is related to pure injustice with respect to the happiness and wretchedness of the men possessing them, right? That's what we want to find out. So pure justice and pure injustice, right? So the perfectly just city and then the sort of tyrant as the end point. We're comparing the happiness and wretchedness of the man possessing them. In this way, we may be persuaded either by Thrasymachus and pursue injustice, or by the argument that is now coming to light, i.e. the one that Socrates has been sort of putting forward throughout this entire book, or coming to light and pursue justice. So that, notice here, we're sort of coming to the end of book 8 here. We're sort of coming to the end of the book as a whole, and we've still got this central question here as our concern. Was Thrasymachus right that injustice is more profitable and leads to happiness, or is Socrates right that it's justice that produces that sort of natural flourishing and development of the human soul and human capacities? So this is where things come to a head. Now, I guess the most difficult thing to explain here is, at least for Plato, is how the just city collapses, right? It's supposed to be the perfect city, but we need a story about what happens to it, about how it kind of falls. And we sort of get that on page 224 with this idea of, it's basically this sort of story about, and there's some weird mathematics that come into this that sort of shape the story. But there's so we saw this in chapter 5, the kind of arrangements that have to be made for the nurturing of children, the kind of eugenics, birthing the best children and sort of getting rid of the worst ones. And there's a time at which those things are kind of neglected. They will at some time beget children that they should not, as Socrates says. So it's when that sort of order comes, that order sort of starts to break down. Children who are not fitted are then raised as guardians, and they're not given a proper education, and all that stuff about music and gymnastics that we work through, all that stuff is neglected. So at some point, the aristocracy, the just city, collapses in this way, and that leads to the emergence of the next regime, the first kind of conflicted and unjust regime in relation to the just city. And this regime is what Plato calls timocracy, the rule of spirit. It's one that's particularly concerned, as we would expect with the idea of spirit, it's particularly concerned with honor, sort of valiant action, social standing, and all of these things that are important to the spirited person who wants sort of to be recognized as somebody possessing pride and wants to be recognized as having self-esteem and respected. So this is how Socrates describes it: being afraid to bring the wise to the ruling offices, because the men of that kind it possesses are no longer simple and earnest, but mixed. And in leaning towards spirited and simpler men naturally more directed to war than to peace, right? And we've had that sort of thing about spiritedness the whole time, that there's part of it that sort of wants to make war. There's a sort of aggressive part that wants to exercise itself maybe in destructive ways. And of course, without the constraining role of reason, that sort of comes out. So in Spirits in Charge, we get a very sort of warlike society that's focused on honor and defending honor. And because there's no independent authority that can tell you when your honor's been when you've sort of properly made amends, everything escalates all the time, and war and conflict continually escalates. Socrates says, in holding the wiles and stratagems of war in honor and in spending all its time making war, won't most such aspects be peculiar to this regime? So a particular sort of warlike, not a kind of peaceful and rationally governed regime. Now, this is something that runs throughout the chapter, where Plato, through Socrates, tells us a psychological story, in each case about how the regime arises, this time about timocracy. And here we get a psychological story, it's on page 26 to 27, 226 to 27, about a son who is taught to despise his father's lack of interest in power and wealth. So the son regards that as a shame, and he's taught by his mother to recognize that as a shame. And he becomes, quote, a haughty-minded man who loves honor. Right, so how does timocracy arise? Note, this is a psychological story, right? It's a story about an individual, a young man who suffers this kind of psychological trauma, and that sort of has this effect on his soul. The structure of the soul changes to one that favors honor as a kind of compensation for this kind of shame and disgrace that it sort of went through in experiencing the sort of the father's lack of interest in power and wealth. So it's a psychological story that Plato tells to explain this idea of historical and social change. And the reason for that, the reason Plato draws on psychology is simply because I think he doesn't have available the social sciences and humanities. He's writing 2,500 years ago, so obviously those things are not developed yet. So he doesn't have a strong sort of available resources to explain why societies change and collapse. We know much more about that today in terms of economics and how economic factors affect how societies collapse. Social factors and cultural factors, we can analyze those separately and see how they kind of interact. All Plato had was psychology, and in essence he's sort of the world's first great psychologist, I think, and so he relies and draws on that sort of psychological resources he has to build this story about social change. But I think it inevitably looks impoverished to us today, because we have, I think, much richer resources in the social sciences and humanities, in the work of the science of history and economics and sociology and so on, can help us explain this much better than psychology by itself. Okay, so after timocracy, we come to oligarchy. As Socrates says, the regime founded on a property assessment. So in other words, you have to have a certain amount of property or wealth in order to take part in public action and to take part in political life. So it's effectively the rule of the rich. And we've seen Plato make the point in the ship analogy, and he makes the point here as well, that the rich are unskilled pilots. There's nothing about being rich that gives you any particular expertise in ruling. They're completely different skills and talents. And so to sort of mix the two up, you end up with pilots who are unskilled in the art of ruling, right? Notice this sort of goes back to Socrates' idea that ruling is a kind of expertise, and you need expertise to do it. Now, also here we find another sort of shift in the arrangements of the soul. It's no longer the rule of desire. It's no longer the rule of spirit. It's now the rule of desire, but in the limited sense of necessary desire, right? And I think the point here is that in order to sort of be an oligarch, in order to build wealth, it's all about desire, but in a restrained sense of accumulation. And in a sense, you have to keep all your other desires in check in order to make that happen, right? So it's only by sort of keeping certain other desires in check and maintaining a focus on building wealth for its own sake that you can sort of live as an oligarch. So it's the rule of desire, but in the sense of necessary desire, that it's limited towards building wealth. And the point is made as well that it leads to a very harmful divide between the rich and the poor. And of course, this was probably the experience of Athenian society before the sort of transition to democracy, this extreme divisions developing between rich and poor, which were partially alleviated in the era of Pericles when Socrates was alive, but certainly in a regime founded on property, there's a kind of logic to saying those economic divides become much starker. Okay, so after oligarchy, we get to democracy. And so here, literally, it's the rule of the people, or as we know by now, that means here the rule of the mob, the rule of the masses, the rule of the unwashed, the rule of the plebs, right? So it's the demos that rules. And Socrates tells us, then democracy, I suppose, comes into being when the poor win. So on this conception, it's a kind of democracy arises when the oligarchy is overthrown. And in the limited sense of the democracy in Greek society, this meant the extension towards the ordinary citizens who were not wealthy, right? Now, it didn't necessarily mean the extension to slaves and so on, but the reference here to the poor is that reference to the kind of the ordinary citizens who weren't wealthy. So they experience all these great sort of advantages when democracy comes into being, so that the democracy comes to focus its sort of wealth and resources on them rather than just on the wealthy. So that's an important point that Socrates makes. Now, the two big things that Plato talks about here through Socrates about democracy are the two things that are still have to mention today as crucial to what it means to live in a democracy, and those are equality and freedom. And Socrates' argument is that both of those things are sort of perverted or corrupted in a democracy. That there's a perversion of equality, and as we'll see, there's a perversion of freedom too. The perversion of equality goes like this, that equals and unequals are treated alike. And here's what we hear on page 236. This regime's sympathy and total lack of pettiness in despising what we were saying so solemnly, that unless a man has a transcendent nature, he would never become good if from earliest childhood his play isn't noble and all his practices aren't such, right? Music and gymnastics, etc., etc. How magnificently it tramples all this underfoot and doesn't care at all from what kinds of practices a man goes to political action, but honors him if only he says he's well disposed towards the multitude, right? So again, here we have this this treating equal of things which are not alike. We saw Socrates' sort of vision for the guardian, the leadership, somebody who is sort of from the beginning doesn't have any of these influences that create this sort of perversion of the soul. Everything else, the influences they hear are sort of positive and good influences. They're sort of attuned by music and gymnastics, right? So in a democracy, it doesn't matter how you were raised, where you come from, what practices you come from, right? Everybody sort of competes on an equal footing, and there's a claim here that that's the sort of equality of unequals, right? That somebody can sort of get in front of a crowd and persuade people, but of course, if their character hasn't been formed to act in a way that's truthful and to act in a way that's loyal, it doesn't really matter what they say, right? So we can no longer distinguish these sort of things that are really unequal because of this sort of democratic perversion. So it's in democracy that and this is in contrast to oligarchy, the unnecessary and useless pleasures, and that means a sort of more restrained form, a more unrestrained form of desire comes to dominate in the soul. So following from the perversion of equality again, all desires must be honored on an equal basis, right? So again, the equality of unequals, all desires are treated alike, even the unnecessary and useless ones. And as we'll see, this is sort of central to Plato's picture of democracy, that there's no restraint and regulation on desire. People do whatever they happen to want, and that creates a sort of situation of a kind of chaos of momentary focus, but no kind of long-term sort of focus and plan. And this is this is Plato's sort of criticism of the democratic soul, that there's the inconstancy of desire makes it impossible to have a sort of long-term focus on your good and to live according to that focus in a kind of disciplined and committed basis on a day-to-day, month-to-month, and year-to-year. Here's how Socrates describes the democratic soul. He says, then he said, it also lives along day by day, gratifying the desire that occurs to him. At one time drinking and listening to the flute, at another drowning water and reducing, now practicing gymnastic, and again idling and neglecting everything, and sometimes spending his time as though he were occupied with philosophy. Often he engages in politics, jumping up, says and does whatever chances to come to him. If he admires any soldiers, he turns in that direction. If moneymakers, it's that one. And there is neither order nor necessity in his life, but calling this life sweet, free, and blessed, he follows it throughout. There you can see, I think, the vast difference in Socrates' perspective and how he's sort of picturing the citizen in a democracy as kind of almost being led by the nose from one thing to another. It's as though their desires are sort of pulling them around. Right now they see this and it's a flashing light and they're occupied in it, but then they'll see something else and they'll go in that direction. And it's like they're just led by whatever takes their attention, right? And there is neither order nor necessity in his life. That's an important phrase there to show, I think, where Socrates is coming from, right? That there's no idea of the good that is pursued systematically, right? The person doesn't make choices based on their long-term interest, based on what they want to make of themselves, based on what their flourishing requires. There's this inconstancy where they're just motivated by whatever they happen to want at the moment. And I think it's that difference between whatever you happen to want and the kind of the choices being led by a sense of sort of long-term good that holds desire in check. That's the difference that Socrates is appealing to here. And the question is is this kind of a viable critique of people in democracy? You know, look around, do people really behave like this? What sort of things does this really describe? And so we can sort of get a sense by asking ourselves that question. You know, where do we see these phenomena? You know, do we sort of see this criticism come to life in the way people behave in democracies? That's something that I think we all should be thinking about as we read through this, and read through the critique of democracy in particular in this chapter. Now, in the case of freedom, freedom is sort of interpreted by Plato in this negative sense, negative for him, as the absence of hierarchy, right? So we find these statements as the Socrates tells us here about freedom, that he takes to be sort of negative statements about what happens to freedom in a democracy, that it becomes the complete absence of hierarchy and order. So we have rulers who are like the ruled, and ruled who are like the rulers. We also hear about, you know, the rich like to dress like the poor, and so on and so on. Right, so there's sort of breaking down of boundaries of status between people, and no sort of natural distinctions between the rulers and the ruled. The father fears the child, and the child has no fear and shame before the parents, right? So the breaking down of parental authority. And again, these fears are sort of periodically raised, right, about how there's no authority anymore, parents can't discipline their children. And so we've, you know, these debates sort of come back periodically about whether this has anything to do with democracy and the sort of softening that democracy produces. Parents can no longer sort of discipline their children properly. Children have no fear of their parents. But again, you know, Socrates is presenting this as a sort of bad thing, and we're led to think of this in that way in this chapter. But, you know, retaining hold of our critical faculties here, we have to ask, is it really a bad thing, right? When, you know, the parental authority, we can see there are some positive sort of consequences of that, but of course it's also hidden a lot of abuse through history, and you know, it's taken a long time to us to get to the stage we are today, where we recognize that children have certain rights. They can't be beaten and abused just willy-nilly. So is this a good argument? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it is, given our experience of how sort of giving rights to the child hasn't been an entirely bad thing. But again, you know, we all have to think about this for ourselves and whether this speaks to our own experience. Thirdly, slaves are no less free than those who have bought them. Again, is that a bad thing? You know, obviously we're in a different sort of situation today, where slavery has been officially and ostensibly abolished, but we can still sort of recognize this question about hierarchy. And again, Plato is worried about the collapse of hierarchy and the collapse of these hierarchies between between citizens of different or sort of people of different status in the city. And I think it's hard to share that concern that Plato is evincing here about the loss of that kind of hierarchy. And finally, and this is a curious one, and I honestly I'm not sure what to make of this, but in this litany of complaints, we then hear about freedom in the relations of men with women and women with men, and that's kind of curious, isn't it? Because we've been, in chapter 5, we've gone through this argument about how women are going to be in all of the three classes. They're going to be rulers, they're going to be guardians. They compete for those positions. They're judged based on their merits, on their natural merits, just like men are. But here we hear that somehow that's now become a problem, that freedom in the relations of men with women. Maybe what is he talking about here? Is he talking about more kind of cultural relations? Is he talking about how men and women dress? That's odd when he's sort of been, again, defending the idea of them doing gymnastic together and sort of dressing in presumably gymnastic, whatever attire is suitable. So yeah, this is puzzling. This this doesn't sort of gel with the tenor of some other things in the text, and it's not clear exactly what this is referring to. Bigger point here is, again, the suggestion here is that all of these things are bad things, but we should certainly be retaining our and exercising our critical faculties here and saying, well, are these things really bad? If this is what a democracy does, should we see it in the negative light that Plato and Socrates are suggesting that we do? And all of that is kind of summed up in this quote on page 242, where Socrates says again, do you notice how tender they make the citizen's soul, so that if someone proposes anything that smacks in any way of slavery, they are irritated and can't stand it, and they end up, as you well know, by paying no attention to the laws, written or unwritten, in order that they may avoid having any master at all. Right, this has become a sort of cultural theme of people sort of not wanting to be restrained by sort of law and custom, finding that intolerable, and sort of finding any kind of law or imposition intolerable. And it's interesting to find Socrates sort of making that point here. Again, it might be that there's something to this phenomenon, but we don't exactly know what it is and exactly what it means, that sort of people become like this, that there's this sort of trait in democracies. You know, putting a sort of good slant on it, you could say it's a sort of there's a greater sort of tendency to criticize, to sort of use our own capacity to think in deciding what things we accept and we don't in a democracy. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So where are the, we have to sort of really think this through, and think in concrete terms about our society, about democracy, and think, whether this really stands up. Whether this argument really stands up, that this is a kind of a problem that leads to the kind of chaos and corruption that Socrates is saying that it does. So we get this really famous phrase, I think, in this book 8, where Socrates claims that too much freedom seems to change into nothing but too much slavery, both for private man and for city. And so this is the transition to the worst regime, which is tyranny, which is that, so the transition here into too much slavery, it's as though the suggestion seems to be that freedom is it becomes such a burden because it's sort of so, people get so sort of, bound up with sort of thinking about the potential constraints and how they're not getting what they want and how they're being sort of shunted from one thing to another by the sort of addicting nature of desire. And it's as though, and Socrates says here, they'll do anything to get out of that condition, even buy into a tyrant, right? So it's that excess freedom leading to that sort of excess conflict and unhappiness that leads to the desire for everybody to submit to a tyrant. And that's how tyranny is born from democracy, as Plato tells this story. And again, we have to remember here that the tyrant, this is the figure of happiness for Thrasymachus, the person who gets to rule and impose their view of justice on everybody else. Socrates tells us here that, in fact, Thrasymachus's view, and here is where we see the reasoning of why that view is wrong. So the tyrant is described as a slave to his desires, and he's also afraid of those desires and afraid of other people. We hear about the tyrant having terrible dreams that frighten them. So it sounds like, the way Plato describes this again, it sounds like the ever-deepening stages of an addiction, that the tyrant is sort of frightened of their own desires. They're always looking for security, and security always means having to do violent things to sort of maintain that security. They're obsessed with war and always sort of having to go to war because of that sense that they're not kind of secure, and they need to sort of establish that sense of safety. So it's not a happy place. It's being driven by these sort of very dark desires that have sort of been unleashed, and in being driven by those desires, the tyrant is like in the grip of a very strong and painful addiction that they can't get out of. All right, so let's sum up what we've learned from Book 8, our last book on the Republic. So we heard about the cycle of regimes, in which each regime that appears is worse than the last. And each regime, as we saw, collapses because of its own intrinsic vice. We saw that each regime represents an arrangement of the human soul writ large. So this was sort of the logic of looking for the sort of just person in the just city to begin with, because that's what each regime basically is. It's the soul blown up to the level of the society as a whole. So each successive arrangement, each regime that appears, is more disordered and conflicted than the last, and hence less happy. So that's what we saw progressing from the just city to democracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. Each soul in those regimes is more disordered than the last. We go from the sort of control of spirit to necessary desire to unnecessary desire to the sort of, in the case of the tyrant, to sort of frightening and suppressed desires, which now come out and control the tyrant's action. So the soul has become more conflicted, more disordered, and hence it's less happy. It can't concentrate on its own long-term good. It can't focus on achieving that. It's just driven by these desires. So we saw as well, Socrates says a lot about the faults of democracy, but I think we're well entitled to ask when we read through this, how good are these criticisms? How good are these criticisms about equality and freedom in particular? Do they speak to faults of democracy? Do they speak to the ways in which the kind of hierarchy that Socrates champions, or maybe Plato is championing through Socrates, is that hierarchy not as compelling as he seems to believe, right? Is that hierarchy in fact more harmful and more constraining? And are we sort of more aware of that today than in Socrates was in that time? And how could we make that argument looking at how our democracy works today? So I think those are some of the major questions we're left with thinking about Plato and thinking about this chapter. We've been reading through the whole of the Republic and considering these questions about justice and democracy and the soul and morality all of the way through. And I think there's a lot we can learn from Plato in terms of the really important questions and how we sort of approach them. And that's why I think this book is always worth coming back to, because of the way it allows us to get to grips with the really sort of central questions about society and about democracy and about morality and justice and how they interact.